The question that broke the silence as rain was falling gently over Mountain View when Sundar Pichai stood in the green room of a TV studio, waiting for his turn. He had been through many interviews before, hundreds, maybe thousands. He thought nothing could surprise him anymore. But this one was different. This time, they had invited his 12-year-old son, Arav, to join him on live TV. The producer walked in and smiled. 5 minutes, she said. Sundar nodded politely, hiding his nervousness. Arav was sitting in the corner, staring at the floor, his small fingers fidgeting with a worn-out bracelet. Sundar walked over and sat beside him. "Are you ready?" Sundar asked softly. Arav looked up and nodded, though his eyes looked distant, troubled somehow. "Just speak from your heart," Sundar added. "They just wanted to know about school, your hobbies, nothing scary." But Sundar didn't know that Arav had been carrying something heavy inside him for weeks. Something he hadn't dared to share even with his father. The cameras turned on. The lights glowed. They walked onto the stage, sat down in the soft chairs. The host smiled wide and began with warm, easy questions about technology and life at home. Sundar answered them smoothly, with his usual humility. The audience laughed a few times. Arav stayed quiet, giving short, polite answers. Then the host leaned forward and asked Arav a simple question. "What inspires you the most about your father?" The boy hesitated. His lips parted, then closed. He looked at his father, then back at the host, and then he said, "Jesus." The studio fell silent for a moment. The host chuckled awkwardly. "Jesus? Can you tell us why?" Arav took a breath and spoke in a clear voice. "Because Jesus taught people to forgive. He taught people to love even their enemies. I wish my father would remember that more." The words sliced through the quiet air like a knife. Sundar's heart dropped. The host's smile faded into confusion. "What do you mean, Arav?" The host asked gently. Arav looked down, tears welling in his eyes. "He's so kind to everyone in the world," he whispered. "But at home, sometimes he forgets to be kind to himself. And to us." The audience gasped softly. Sundar's chest tightened. He wanted to speak, to explain, but no words came out. He felt like the floor had disappeared beneath him. The host tried to lighten the mood, changing the subject quickly. But the boy's words stayed hanging in the air, impossible to ignore. After the show, back in the green room, Sundar finally asked, "Why did you say that on TV, Arav?" The boy looked up at him with trembling eyes and said quietly, "Because it's the only way you would listen." For the first time in years, Sundar felt completely exposed, and just as he was about to respond, his phone buzzed loudly. He glanced down and saw a message flashing on the screen. "There's more your son hasn't told you. Meet me tonight at the place where it all began." There was no name, no number, only those words. He stared at the phone, heart pounding as the boy wiped his tears and whispered, "You're not going to like what you find out." Asterisk, the place where it all began. The car ride home from the studio was unusually quiet. Rain still drizzled against the window, tiny rivers racing each other down the glass. Sundar sat in the back seat next to Arav, who kept staring out at the dark streets, his breath fogging the glass. Sundar's phone lay heavy in his pocket, that strange message still glowing in his mind. "There's more your son hasn't told you. Meet me tonight at the place where it all began." He kept replaying the words, trying to figure out who could have sent them. What did they mean? What else was his son hiding from him? And what place were they talking about? He wanted to ask Arav about it right then, but something about the boy's quiet, almost defeated posture made him stop. Sundar had spent his whole career solving problems before they got worse. But now, looking at his son, he realized he had no idea where to even begin. When they reached home, Arav went straight to his room without saying a word. The door closed gently behind him. Sundar stood there in the hallway for a few moments, staring at the door, feeling a heaviness settle into his chest. He walked slowly to his own study and sat down at his desk. The rain was louder now, drumming on the roof. He took out his phone again and read the message over and over. "There is more your son hasn't told you. Meet me tonight at the place where it all began." He thought back through the years, trying to remember. Where had it all begun? His mind wandered to Chennai, his childhood home. He remembered his parents' small apartment, the smell of spice and dust, the warmth of crowded rooms. But no, it couldn't be that. Then he thought of the first office in Silicon Valley, a cramped little building with flickering lights. But no again. That didn't feel right in a dot then. Almost without thinking, his eyes drifted to the bookshelf. Tucked between the rows of books was a small wooden box, old and faded. He pulled it out carefully and opened it. Inside was a single photograph. It showed a park bench near a quiet pond, and on that bench, a much younger Sundar sat with his wife and their newborn. Arav wrapped in a soft blue blanket. He stared at the picture for a long time. The place where it all began. He stood up suddenly, slipping the photograph into his coat pocket. He glanced at the clock. It was already close to midnight outside. The air was cold and damp as he walked toward his car. The streets were nearly empty, only the sound of tires splashing through puddles breaking the silence. He drove without the radio on, his hands gripping. The wheel tightly when he reached the park. He parked under a flickering street lamp and stepped out into the dark. The pond shimmered faintly under the moonlight, and the bench was still there, exactly where it had been all those years ago. He walked toward it slowly, feeling a strange mix of fear and hope swirling in his stomach. But before he could reach the bench, a shadow moved. Someone was already sitting there. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. The figure stood up slowly and turned toward him. It was a woman, her face hidden by the hood of her coat. "You came?" she said softly. Her voice was familiar, though he couldn't quite place it. "Who are you?" Sundar asked, his own voice sharper than he intended. She pulled back her hood, and for a moment he couldn't believe what he was seeing. It was Anjali, his childhood friend from Chennai, the girl who had once been his closest confidant before. "They drifted apart, Anjali?" He whispered. She gave a small, sad smile. "It's been a long time," she said. What are you doing here? What is this about?" he asked, still trying to make sense of it all. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small envelope. She handed it to him, her fingers trembling slightly. "Your son. He came to me," she said quietly. Sundar felt his stomach turn cold. "What do you mean?" "He demanded. He came to me," she repeated, her voice breaking now. 2 weeks ago. He found me somehow. He said he couldn't talk to you. He said he needed someone who would listen. And he told me everything." Sundar stared at her, the envelope burning in his hands. "What did he tell you?" he asked, almost afraid of the answer. Anjali stepped back, her eyes glistening. "Read it," she whispered. "But you should know. Once you read this, you can't go back to how things were." The air felt heavier now, the sound of the rain growing louder around them. Sundar looked down at the envelope, then back up at her. But she was already walking away, disappearing into the darkness. He stood there alone, the envelope in his hands, feeling the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. Pressing down on him. Finally, with trembling fingers, he tore it open and unfolded the letter inside. The handwriting was small and uneven, Arav's handwriting. He began to read. "Dear Papa, I know you're busy, so I didn't want to bother you. But I feel like if I don't say this now, I might never get the chance. There's something I need to tell you about what happened at school. Something you don't know. And it's not just about me. It's about you too. But before he could finish, a loud noise startled him. The sound of footsteps rushing toward him from behind. He spun around just in time to see a dark figure lunging at him, knocking the letter from his hands. He stumbled backward, falling hard onto the wet grass. The figure leaned in close, whispering in a low, harsh voice, "Stop looking. If you care about your son, you'll forget you ever came here." Then the figure disappeared into the shadows, leaving Sundar lying there, breathless. The letter crumpled and wet on the ground. He picked it up with shaking hands. But the rain had already smudged the ink, the words running together into something unreadable. He stared at the ruined letter, his heart pounding, and realized he had no choice now. Whatever his son was hiding, someone didn't want him to find out, and that meant he had to asterisk the secrets. In the shadows, the rain finally stopped around 3 in the morning, but the air was still heavy and cold when Sundar returned to his car. He sat there for a long time, staring out at the dark park, the ruined letter clutched in his hands. The ink had bled so badly it was impossible to make out the words now. All that remained were faint streaks of blue and black, smudged into the paper like bruises. He ran his fingers over the wet page as if touching it gently enough might bring the words back, but nothing happened. The truth, whatever it was, had slipped away, at least for now. He leaned back in the seat, closed his eyes, and thought about the figure that had attacked him. He could still hear the harsh whisper in his ear. Stop looking. If you care about your son, you'll forget you ever came here. Asterisk. But he couldn't forget, not now. Not after seeing the way Arav's small shoulders had slumped under the weight of whatever he was carrying. Not after seeing the fear in his eyes when she said, "You're not going to like what you find out." The roads were empty as he drove home, the tires humming softly on the slick pavement. The city was asleep, the windows dark, the silence broken only by the occasional bark of a distant dog or the faint cry of an owl. He thought about waking Arav up, asking him everything, demanding the truth right then and there. But something inside him stopped him. If his son had gone to someone else, to Anjali, and not to him, there had to be a reason. Maybe pushing too hard would only make him retreat even further. He pulled into the driveway and sat there for a moment, looking up at the house. One window on the second floor glowed faintly. Arav's room got when he stepped inside. The house felt colder than usual. The faint smell of rain mixed with the quiet ticking of the hallway clock. He walked up the stairs slowly and stood outside his son's door, listening. There was no sound, just the soft rhythm of breathing from within. He thought about knocking. Instead, he turned and went back to his own room. He didn't sleep. Instead, he sat at his desk with the ruined letter laid out in front of him. He kept staring at it, as if his eyes might somehow untangle the blurry words. His mind kept circling back to Anjali, her eyes shining with worry, her hands trembling when she handed him the envelope. She had said, "He told me everything." But everything about what? When the first pale light of dawn slipped through the curtains, Sundar picked up his phone and dialed her number. It rang, and just when he thought she wouldn't answer, a tired voice came on the line. "You shouldn't call me," she said softly. "Anjali," he said, his own voice cracking. "Please, I need to know what's going on. Someone attacked me last night. Someone doesn't want me to find out. But I need to know. It's my son." There was silence for a long time on the other end of the line. Then she spoke, almost a whisper. "You don't understand. This is bigger than you. Bigger than him. What does that mean?" He demanded. "Meet me," she said finally. "But not here. It's not safe. Do you remember the old train station outside town? The one that's been abandoned for years?" "Yes," he said. "Come tonight. Midnight. Don't bring anyone. And don't tell Arav." Then the line went dead. That day passed in a blur. Sundar sat through meetings he didn't remember, nodded at people he didn't hear, stared at. Slides he couldn't see? All he could think about was midnight. The train station. The truth. He watched his son from a distance that evening. Watched him eat dinner quietly. Watched him retreat to his room again without a word. He wanted to reach out to say something, but every time he opened his mouth, the words felt wrong. When the clock struck 11:30, he slipped out of the house without making a sound. The abandoned station stood at the edge of town, forgotten. By time, its windows were boarded up, and weeds grew between the cracked stones of the platform. A single flickering light bulb above the entrance buzzed faintly in the dark. He parked the car and stepped out, his breath misting in the cold air. He walked through the broken doors into the station. The air inside smelled of damp wood and rust. Moonlight streamed through gaps in the roof, casting pale shadows on the floor top, and then he saw her. Anjali stood near the far wall, her coat pulled tight around her, a folder clutched in her hands. She looked up when she heard him and gave a small nod. "You came?" she said. "Of course," he replied. She glanced around nervously before speaking. Listen to me carefully, she began. What I'm about to show you, it's going to change everything. Not just between you and Arav, but everything you think you know about your own life. She handed him the folder. It felt heavy in his hands. He opened it slowly. Inside were photographs, documents, and what looked like pages torn from a journal. He pulled out one of the photographs. It showed a small group of boys standing in a schoolyard. His eyes fell immediately on one boy in the center, Arav, and he felt his stomach turn. Because standing behind Arav, looming over him with a hand gripping his shoulder, was a man Sundar recognized, a man Sundar thought he would never see again. The very man who had once destroyed everything Sundar's father had built back in India. His hand shook as he looked at the next page, a printout of an email chain between Arav and someone using the name Shepherd. The email spoke of secret meetings, threats, promises of protection, and something called the Circle. He looked up at Anjali, his heart pounding in his ears. What is this? He demanded. She reached into her pocket and pulled out one last thing, a small silver cross on a chain. She pressed it into his palm. He came to me because he was scared, she said. Because he thought you wouldn't believe him, and because someone from your past has been watching him, following him, waiting. Sundar stared down at the cross. It was warm, as though it had been held for a long time. Why didn't he tell me? He whispered, because he thought it would break you. She replied, before he could say anything more. A sound echoed through the station, the sharp crack of a footstep behind them. They both rose. Sundar turned slowly. And in the shadows, by the doorway, a figure stepped forward, tall, broad-shouldered, face hidden under a hood. The same voice from the park spoke again, low and threatening. You were warned, the figure said. Now it's too late. And then the lights went out. In the pitch black, Sundar heard Anjali scream, the folder torn from his hands. And something hard struck the back of his head. When he opened his eyes again, the station was empty. The folder was gone, and Anjali was nowhere to be found. But on the floor beside him, one thing remained. The silver cross, and carved into the wood of the platform, just visible in the moonlight, were 3 words, find the circle. Asterisk the circle when Sundar woke the next morning. The world outside his window was bright and quiet, as if nothing had happened. But inside his mind, the shadows still clung to him. The silver cross sat on his desk where he'd left it after stumbling back from the station hours earlier, and carved into his memory were those 3 words, find the circle. He stared at the cross for a long time, turning it over and over in his fingers. It felt heavier than it looked, its edges warm from his grip. It amazed him how something so small could carry so much meaning or danger. He thought about Anjali, her scream echoing in the dark, her face swallowed by the shadows as she was taken. Wherever she was now, she had risked herself to show him the truth. And now she was gone. Down the hall, he heard the faint sound of Arav laughing. It was a soft, careful laugh, the kind that almost sounded like it didn't belong to a child. Sundar walked quietly to the door of his son's room and stood there for a moment, listening. Inside, Arav sat on his bed, talking into his tablet. His voice was quiet but clear. I don't know if he's ready yet, Arav said, but I hope he will be soon. Sundar stepped back before his son could see him and returned to his study. The words haunted him. Ready for what? How much did his son already know? He sat at his desk and pulled out the few fragments he still had. The ruined letter, the photographs from the folder, the emails between Arav and the mysterious shepherd. He laid them out in front of him, studying them carefully. The emails were the most troubling. In them, Shepherd spoke as though they knew everything. About Sundar's work, his past, his family. And over, the name appeared, the circle. The last email ended with a single sentence. When the circle closes, everything ends. He Googled the phrase. But nothing came up except unrelated links about geometry and philosophy. He tried different combinations. Nothing got. Then he noticed something strange in one of the photographs. It was a small detail he hadn't seen the night before. A pin on the lapel of the man standing behind Arav in the schoolyard. He zoomed and saw it clearly. A circle with a line through the middle, almost like an eye. He leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. That symbol. It stirred something deep in his memory, something buried. And then he remembered his father's old notebook. He rushed to the closet and pulled out a dusty box from the top shelf. Inside, among old papers and yellowed photographs, was a leather-bound notebook he hadn't touched in decades. His father had kept meticulous notes back then, filling page after page with numbers, sketches, and thoughts that Sundar had never understood. He flipped through the pages quickly until he found it. A hand-drawn circle with the same line through it, and a single phrase written below in Tamil, or such a medium. The circle will close. His father had written it over and over in the margins of the book, like he had been trying to warn himself. Sundar sat there staring at the words, his hands cold. All these years, he had thought his father's strange habits were just the eccentricities of an aging man. But now he wondered if his father had known about this long before Sundar ever did. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of his phone buzzing. He glanced down and saw an unknown number flashing on the screen. After a moment of hesitation, he answered. "You're getting too close." A low voice said on the other end. Sundar froze. "Who is this?" "Someone who still wants to help you," the voice said. "But you have to listen carefully. The circle is watching. They don't forgive. They don't forget. If you really want to find the truth, go to where your father's story ended." "Where?" Sundar demanded, but the line had already gone dead. He sat there in silence for a long time, the words sinking in. Where your father's story ended. He thought back again. His father had died in a hospital in Chennai, after what everyone said was a heart attack. But Sundar had always suspected. There was more to it. He remembered being 17, standing outside his father's hospital room late at night, hearing muffled voices arguing inside. And he remembered the strange man in the dark suit who left the room just before his father flatlined, without ever looking back. Now, after all these years, that memory felt sharper, more real. By late afternoon, he was already on a plane to Chennai. He didn't tell Arav. He didn't tell anyone. He sat by the window and watched the clouds blur past as the world below grew darker and smaller. When he landed, the city was awake and alive with noise and color, but he felt none of it. He went straight to the old hospital where his father had died. It hadn't changed much, the same faded paint, the same faint smell of disinfectant and dust. He walked slowly down the familiar corridor until he reached the door of his father's room. He stood there for a moment before pushing it open. The room was empty now, just a bed and a small table. But as he stepped inside, he noticed something carved faintly into the wall above the headboard, a circle with a line through it. His heart pounded as he reached out to touch it. And when he did, he felt the edge of something loose behind the plaster. He dug his fingers in and pulled away a small section of the wall, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was another notebook, this one newer than the one he had found at home. He opened it and flipped through the pages. There were names, dates, places, and in the back, a single envelope with his name on it. He opened it with shaking hands and read, "My son, if you're reading this, it means the circle has found you too. They are older than you know, more powerful than you imagine. They watch everything. They control everything. And once you begin to see them, they will come for you. Protect the boy. He is the key. Everything depends on him." The letter slipped from his fingers as the door behind him creaked open. He turned slowly, his breath catching in his throat. Standing in the doorway was Arav. His son's face was pale, his eyes wide, but there was something calm in his voice when he spoke. "You weren't supposed to find this yet," Arav said quietly. "What are you doing here?" Sundar whispered. Arav stepped into the room, his gaze steady. "They told me to wait until you were ready," he said. "But now we don't have time." "What do you mean?" Sundar asked, his voice cracking. Arav walked over, picked up the notebook, and tucked it under his arm. They're already here, he said, and they're coming for both of us. And then, as if to prove his words, a shadow moved in the corner of the room. The lights flickered, and a deep, unfamiliar voice spoke from the darkness. You should have listened when we warned you. Asterisk the room of whispers there inside the hospital. The room turned colder, as though someone had opened a window to another world. Sundar stood frozen, his back against the wall, as the shadow in the corner began to take shape. The figure stepped forward slowly, its face still hidden under the hood of a long coat. Arav didn't flinch. Instead, he gripped the notebook tighter against his chest and took one small step in front of his father. The voice from the figure was deep and calm, but there was an edge of something darker underneath. You should have listened when we warned you, it said again. Who are you? Sundar managed to say, though his voice came out hoarse. The figure ignored him, its attention fixed on Arav. It's time, the voice said. Come with me. You were never supposed to bring him into this. But Arav shook his head. Not yet, he said firmly. He deserves to know everything. The figure moved closer, the sound of its steps echoing unnaturally loud on the linoleum floor. It stopped just inches away from Arav, towering over him. Sundar felt his hands clench into fists, ready to defend his son no matter the cost. But before he could move, Arav held up his hand. Please, Papa, he said quietly, without looking back. Just trust me this once. Something in his son's voice, steady, sad, and so much older than his years, made Sundar stop. He watched as Arav opened the notebook and turned to a page near the end, then held it up toward the figure. The figure studied it for a long moment, then nodded once and stepped back into the shadows. The room grew warmer again, the light stopped flickering, and they were alone. Sundar sank into the nearest chair, his legs suddenly weak. He stared at his son, who now stood silently in the middle of the room, still clutching the notebook. What? What just happened? Sundar whispered A-R-A, turned slowly to face him, his eyes shining with something that looked like both fear and determination. You need to understand, Papa, he said. And they're not just watching. They're waiting. They've been waiting. For me since before I was even born. Who are they? Sundar asked, his voice shaking. What is the circle? Arav walked over to him, knelt down so their eyes were level, and opened the notebook to the first page. He pointed to a line written in his grandfather's handwriting. The circle is the silence between decisions. The shadow behind power. It is not a group. It is a promise. Sundar frowned, not understanding. Arav flipped to another page, where a list of names was written. Names Sundar recognized from history books. Names of leaders, inventors, and visionaries. At the bottom of the list was his own name, and beneath it, written in a different hand, was Arav's. They chose you, Arav said softly. And because of that, they chose me. It's a chain that never breaks. Unless he stopped, his small hands trembling now. Unless what? Sundar pressed .AARAV, closed the notebook, and stood up. Unless someone finally says no. Sundar felt a chill crawl down his spine. He thought back to his father's last words. The notebook hidden behind the wall. The warning carved into the hospital wall. They're controlling everything? Sundar asked carefully. AARV nodded. Not controlling, he said. Guiding, but not always toward good. They believe everything has to happen a certain way, and anyone who tries to step outside their plan. He trailed off, but the meaning was clear. Sundar buried his face in his hands. Everything he thought he understood about his life, his career, his success, even his family, now felt like pieces of a puzzle someone else had designed. And his son had been carrying this burden alone. Finally, he looked up. Why didn't you tell me before? He asked quietly. AARAV sat down next to him. His small voice cracked when he spoke. Because I thought you would choose them over me. Those words cut deeper than any knife. Sundar reached out and pulled his son close, feeling the boy's heart hammering in his chest. Never, he whispered. Never, Arav. I would never choose anyone over you. But even as he said it, he couldn't shake the feeling that he didn't even know what choice lay ahead. Before he could speak again, Arav pulled away and opened the notebook to one last page. There, in delicate handwriting, was a map. It showed a small, hidden chapel deep in the hills outside Chennai, with a single word written beneath it, sanctuary. That's where it ends, Arav said, his voice steady now. Or where it begins? Again, if we go there, we can finally see the truth. But they'll try to stop us. Sundar stared at the map, then at his son. Then let's go, he said. The two of them left the hospital together under the cover of night, driving into the hills where the city lights faded to darkness. The road twisted and narrowed until it became little more than a dirt path. The air grew colder, and the stars above seemed sharper, more watchful somehow. When they finally reached the end of the path, they found themselves in front of a crumbling stone chapel half buried in vines. A faint light flickered from within, casting long shadows onto the ground. Sundar turned off the car and they both stepped out, their feet crunching on the gravel. The silence here was heavy, almost alive. Arav took his father's hand. Whatever happens, he said softly, don't let go of me. They pushed the heavy wooden doors open, and inside was a single narrow aisle leading to an altar bathed in golden candlelight. Behind the altar, carved into the stone wall, was the same circle symbol, this time larger and more intricate, with strange markings spiraling outward. And waiting at the altar was another figure, robed in white, its face hidden in shadow. Welcome, the figure said in a voice that echoed off the walls. Sundar stepped forward cautiously, pulling Arav with him. We want answers, he said firmly. The figure tilted its head. You came here seeking truth, it said. But truth is never given freely. It must be earned. Then it raised an arm and pointed to the ground in front of the altar, where two circles were etched into the stone, one larger, one smaller, side by side. You must choose, the figure said. Sundar glanced down and saw that inside the smaller circle was Arav's name, glowing faintly. Inside the larger one was his own. Choose what? Sundar demanded. The figure's voice softened, but there was no kindness in it. Which of you stays? It said. And which of you is allowed to leave? Sundar's blood ran cold. He looked at his son, who looked back up at him calmly, as though he had already known this moment was coming, before Sundar could speak. The candles flickered wildly, and the ground beneath the circles began to glow brighter. The sound of whispering rose around them, filling the chapel like a storm, and then the figure spoke one final time, its words cutting through the noise like a blade. You have until the light dies to decide. The circle does not wait. Asterisk, the choice that broke the circle of whispering grew louder, like 1,000 voices speaking all at once. Sundar felt the sound crawling into his ears, his mind, his heart. The two glowing circles on the stone floor pulsed brighter and brighter, casting strange shadows on the walls of the chapel. Arav stood quietly beside him, his small hands still clutching his father's fingers tightly. The robed figure at the altar stood motionless, waiting. The candles began to sputter and dim, the light around them shrinking. Sundar's chest tightened. His breath came in shallow bursts. He could feel time slipping away. What happens? Sundar shouted above the whispers. If I don't choose? The figure finally spoke, its voice calm, but full of something ancient and unyielding. If you choose neither, it said, then the circle chooses for you. And what it chooses cannot be undone. Sundar looked down at the circles on the floor. The smaller one glowed softly, his son's name inscribed in light. The larger one burned brighter, his own name etched in flames. He understood now. The choice was not just who would stay, but who would carry the burden. Who would live with the weight of the circle watching? Who would bear its secrets? He looked at Arav and saw that his son's face was calm, even knowing what was at stake. And Sundar realized then that Arav had come here prepared to step into the smaller circle. Himself. Prepared to give up his childhood, his freedom, maybe even his life, so his father could go on. Sundar's throat tightened. His eyes stung. He knelt down so he was level with his son, blocking out the whispers, the figure, the flickering lights. Just the two of them. You don't have to do this, he said, his voice breaking. Arav looked at him sadly and whispered, but someone has to. Sundar shook his head. Not you, he said. Never you. The whispers rose higher now, like wind howling through a canyon. The light from the candles faded further. Sundar felt the pressure mounting in the room, like the walls themselves were closing in. He looked back at the robed figure and shouted, "There has to be another way." But the figure only repeated the same words as though carved into stone. You must choose. Sundar closed his eyes. He thought about the nights he had spent away from home working, about the moments he'd missed with his son. He thought about the boy sitting quietly at the kitchen table, waiting for his father to notice him. He thought about the day at the TV studio when Arav had finally spoken aloud what Sundar had never been brave enough to hear. I wish my father would remember to be kind to himself. And to us, Dot, he opened his eyes and looked at his son one last time. You deserve better, Sundar said softly. Then, before Arav could stop him, Sundar stepped forward into the larger circle. Immediately, the stone beneath his feet blazed white hot, and the whispers turned into a deafening roar. The robed figure raised both arms and the chapel shook violently, dust falling from the ceiling like snow. The light grew so bright it burned. Rav cried out behind him, but Sundar didn't turn around. He kept his eyes fixed on the figure and shouted over the storm, "Take me, but leave him alone." The figure lowered its arms, and the roaring stopped instantly. Silence fell, heavy and complete. The circle beneath Sundar's feet cooled and dimmed until it was nothing more than a faint outline. The smaller circle, the one with Arav's name, went dark. The figure spoke again, his voice strangely. Gentle now. So it is done, it said. The circle remains unbroken, but it will remember you. Then the figure raised one hand and pointed toward the door. Go, it said. Sundar felt the weight of 1,000 eyes lift from the room. The light returned to the candles. The air warmed. He looked back at Arav, who stood there frozen, tears glistening in his eyes. Papa, Arav whispered. Sundar stepped out of the circle and wrapped his arms around his son. Holding him so tightly, he could feel the boy's heartbeat against his chest. It's all right now, he murmured. You're free. I promise you're free. And for the first time in what felt like years, he believed his own words. When they stepped out of the chapel, the night sky stretched above them, full of stars so bright it hurt to look at them. The hills were quiet, the path empty. The silence felt different now, no longer threatening, but full of possibility. They walked back to the car hand in hand. The notebook was gone. The robed figure was gone. And the chapel stood behind them like a shadow from another life. In the car. As they drove back toward the city, Arav finally broke the silence. You didn't have to do that, he said softly. Sundar glanced at him and smiled faintly. Yes, he said. I did. Arav looked down at his hands, quiet for a moment. Then he asked, what happens now? Sundar thought about it, watching the dark road unwind ahead of them. He thought about the circle, about its whispers, its promises, its threats, and about what it meant to carry it alone. Finally, he answered. Now, he said, we live, one day at a time. And we never forget what matters. Arav leaned, his head against the window, and soon his breathing became steady and soft. Asleep at last, safe. And Sundar kept driving, his hand resting gently on his son's shoulder, his eyes fixed on the horizon, where the first light of dawn was just beginning to break. For the first time in his life, he felt the weight of the circle on his own shoulders, heavy but bearable. Because now he understood what Jesus had meant when he said to love even your enemies. Sometimes the enemy wasn't someone outside you. Sometimes the enemy was the silence in your own heart. And sometimes the way to break it was to choose love. Anyway, in the rearview mirror, the hills faded into darkness behind them. And somewhere far away, in the room of whispers, the circle watched and waited. But Sundar no longer feared it. Because he had already chosen. And this time he chose his. son, asterisk,